A fortune lost, her heiress gone without a trace. Only the shadows know the truth. Welcome to the Via File. I am your host, Victor Harlow. Tell me where you're listening from. I love seeing this community grow. Your comments make every mystery come alive. Let's begin. Ravenshollow Abbey wore its transformation from sacred to secular purpose with the dignity of ancient stones that have witnessed many changes of fortune. The Great Hall, once a nave where monks had chanted their devotions, now served as an elegant reception room where the devotions were rather more worldly, though no less fervent in their way. The October evening light filtered through mullioned windows that had survived both Reformation and Restoration, cast long shadows across Persian carpets laid with careful precision over flagstones worn smooth by centuries of sandaled feet. Electric fixtures, cunningly disguised within wrought iron that might have graced the original scriptorium, provided a warm glow that made the tapestries seem to breathe with remembered life. Inspector Roderick Allyn stood near one of the great windows, a glass of excellent sherry in his hand, observing the careful choreography of arrival that marked the commencement of the Academy's most crucial social ritual. His old Cambridge friend, Dr. Marcus Bellwether, moved through the assembling company with a particular blend of scholarly authority and anxious hospitality that characterized those who must balance educational ideals against financial necessities. The years since their last meeting had treated Bellwether kindly, though the responsibilities of directing an institution dependent upon patronage had etched lines of perpetual concern around his intelligent eyes. Rather atmospheric, wouldn't you say? Bellwether appeared at Allayn's elbow, his voice carrying that note of forced cheerfulness that suggested matters of weight beneath the social surface. I do hope our little gathering won't prove too theatrical for your taste, Roderick. The dramatic arts seem to attract personalities that are, shall we say, rather more vivid than one encounters in ordinary academic circles. Before Allyn could reply, the sound of motor car wheels on gravel drew their attention to the courtyard below. A modest but impeccably maintained Bentley had drawn up before the main entrance, and from it emerged the woman whose generosity had become as essential to the Academy as its medieval foundations. Miss Cordelia Fairfax moved with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to deference without requiring dramatic gestures to command it. At 45, she possessed that particular elegance that speaks of breeding rather than fashion. Her dark hair arranged with understated perfection, her clothes chosen for quality rather than display. The small leather notebook she carried seemed to command as much of her attention as the assembled company awaiting her arrival. "Our most essential patron," Bellwether murmured, and Allyn noted the slight tension that had crept into his friend's voice. "Miss Fairfax has been rather more thorough than usual in her inquiries about our future plans. Nothing specific, you understand, but her questions have been more detailed than one might expect from even the most conscientious benefactor." Accompanying Miss Fairfax was Mrs. Helena Mortimer, whose protective hovering identified her as companion rather than social equal. A woman of similar age but sharper demeanor, she surveyed the Academy's representatives with the assessing eye of someone whose loyalty had been earned through years of faithful service and whose judgment had proven reliable in matters both practical and personal. The arrival set in motion the graceful bustle characteristic of institutions dependent upon maintaining favor with their supporters. Vivian Ashcroft, the Academy's director of productions, emerged from what had once been the abbot's lodging, his theatrical bearing somehow perfectly suited to the Gothic setting. His greeting to Miss Fairfax involved the sort of elaborate courtesy that suggested performance as much as genuine respect. Professor James Whitlock appeared from the direction of the old chapter house, a sheaf of papers clutched in hands that trembled slightly as he approached the patron whose continued goodwill had become essential to the Academy's survival. Throughout the evening's social ritual, Allayn observed the subtle currents beneath the polished surface. Miss Fairfax consulted her notebook with a frequency that suggested either meticulous preparation or pressing concern. Her conversations with Dr. Bellwether, though brief and conducted in tones too low for general hearing, carried an intensity that transcended mere social pleasantry. Professor Whitlock's nervous energy seemed particularly pronounced in the patron's presence, his spectacles requiring frequent adjustment, his papers rustling with the restlessness of anxiety poorly concealed. As the company prepared to move toward the dining hall, Alain caught a fragment of conversation between Miss Fairfax and Dr. Bellwether near the great fireplace. "Tomorrow morning, then," she said, her voice carrying the quiet firmness of someone accustomed to having her arrangements respected. "Before the committee meets." "If you wish," Bellwether replied, and for a moment his scholarly composure slipped enough to reveal something that might have been apprehension. The evening proceeded with the careful grace that marked such gatherings, but beneath the polished surface, Alain sensed the presence of concerns that had nothing to do with theatrical performances or educational philosophy. The patron's progress, it seemed, was to prove rather more complex than the usual ritual of gracious beneficence. Morning came to Ravenshollow Abbey, wrapped in a soft, persistent mist that clung to the ancient stones like the breath of centuries past. The cloisters, where medieval monks had once walked in, contemplation, now provided shelter for conversations that required privacy without the appearance of secrecy. The covered walkway, with its weathered Gothic arches and flagstones worn smooth by generations of sandaled feet, seemed to absorb sound and shadow with equal discretion. Inspector Allen, taking his customary early constitutional, found the atmosphere conducive to reflection upon the subtle tensions he had observed during the previous evening's gathering. The sound of voices drew his attention to the far end of the cloister, where the old scriptorium served as the Academy's administrative office. Miss Cordelia Fairfax emerged from its oak-paneled interior, her morning dress perfectly appropriate, yet suggesting someone who had risen early with particular purpose rather than mere habit. The leather notebook that had commanded so much of her attention remained firmly in her grasp, and her expression carried the focused determination of someone approaching the conclusion of a lengthy investigation. Professor Whitlock appeared shortly thereafter, his usually neat appearance somewhat disheveled, his spectacles requiring the frequent adjustment that had become his characteristic gesture under stress. The conversation that ensued between patron and treasurer took place in tones too subdued for general hearing, but their body language spoke eloquently of matters that transcended routine financial discussion. "The irregularities," Whitlock was saying as Alain drew within earshot, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone forced to acknowledge uncomfortable truths, were never intended as permanent arrangements, merely temporary adjustments to accommodate the rather fluid nature of our funding sources. Miss Fairfax consulted her notebook with deliberate precision. "Temporary arrangements that have persisted for how long, Professor Whitlock?" Her voice retained its customary courtesy, while carrying an undertone that suggested the question was rhetorical rather than genuinely inquiring. Mrs. Helena Mortimer materialized from the direction of the guest quarters with the protective instincts of someone whose professional devotion had evolved into personal loyalty. Her morning survey of the cloister carried the watchful quality of a guardian who sensed potential threats to her charge's welfare. "Cordelia," she said, approaching with careful deference, "perhaps these matters might be better discussed after the morning's rehearsal. Dr. Bellwether was hoping to speak with you about the evening's arrangements." The mention of the Academy's director brought a slight tightening around Miss Fairfax's eyes. "Dr. Bellwether will have to accommodate himself to my timetable today, Helena. There are matters that require resolution before this evening's performance." From the direction of the old chapter house came the sound of theatrical voices, raised in rehearsal, the cadences of Webster's tragedy seeming particularly appropriate to the Gothic setting. Director Ashcroft's voice could be heard above the others, his instructions carrying the intensity of someone whose reputation depended upon the evening's success. "Lights at 30 for the Duchess's exit," he called. "No, not syrup. A celadon wash. It is not a dentist's waiting room." Dr. Bellwether himself appeared as if summoned by the mention of his name, his scholarly composure intact, but his eyes betraying the strain of someone juggling incompatible responsibilities. His greeting to Miss Fairfax carried the particular warmth reserved for essential benefactors, though Alain detected an underlying note of apprehension. "I trust you found your accommodation satisfactory?" Bellwether inquired, his glance toward the notebook revealing his true concerns. "Quite satisfactory," Miss Fairfax replied, her tone equally polished and laden with unspoken meaning. "I've found the morning most illuminating. Professor Whitlock has been remarkably forthcoming about the Academy's financial arrangements." The silence that followed stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable before Bellwether recovered his equilibrium. "Splendid. I do hope any questions have been resolved to your satisfaction." "All will be resolved, Dr. Bellwether. I can assure you of that." Miss Fairfax closed her notebook with the decisive snap of someone who had completed a necessary but unpleasant task. As the morning progressed, Alain observed the careful choreography of preparation. In the makeshift theater, students moved with controlled chaos, adjusting lighting and rehearsing lines in hushed, earnest tones. Ashcroft presided over the rehearsal with theatrical intensity, his movements sketching arabesques in the air as he placed actors and appealed to the electrician, a gentle man with slow hands, and the look of one accustomed to being blamed for phenomena beyond his contrivance. Later, Alain noticed Miss Fairfax and Ashcroft entering the scriptorium together. The ancient room, with its oak table polished by centuries of use and thick glass windows that made everyone seem a figure from an older print, provided an atmospheric backdrop for their conversation. Though their voices remained low, the intensity of their exchange was unmistakable. "If it cannot be justified, Mr. Ashcroft, it must be discontinued," Miss Fairfax was saying. "I do not speak of taste. I speak of obligations." "Obligations are sometimes not companions to necessity," Ashcroft returned, weighing the word for theatrical effect. "We kept the work alive. The work is not a ledger, Miss Fairfax. Nor is it a conjurer's handkerchief. If I am to continue in my office as patron, we must not pretend we do not see what is before us." By noon, the mist had begun to lift, revealing late roses in the gardens and leaves that had already chosen their winter colors. As Alain crossed toward the refectory, he noticed something that gave him pause. At the threshold of the scriptorium door, which stood slightly ajar, lay a thin curl of sealing wax, bright red against the old oak. It lay there like a drop of blood that had survived a century and only now chosen to be noticed. A small detail that suggested something in the Abbey's quiet was not serenity, but suspension. The Abbey's ancient refectory had undergone its evening metamorphosis, with the particular magic that only candlelight and theatrical necessity could provide. Velvet hangings softened the austere lines of medieval stone, while cunningly placed electric fixtures, dimmed to mere whispers of illumination, allowed dozens of candles in wrought iron sconces to cast their dancing shadows across walls that had witnessed centuries of human drama. The makeshift stage, erected where monks had once taken their simple meals, seemed to breathe with anticipation as the Academy's most ambitious production prepared to unfold. The air carried the mingled scent of old wood, warmed beeswax, and the sharper tang of grease paint that marked any theatrical endeavor, amateur or professional. Inspector Allen settled into his seat with the particular pleasure of someone who appreciated both dramatic art and the infinite variety of human nature. His position, carefully chosen by Dr. Bellwether's diplomatic instincts, afforded him an excellent view not only of the performance but of the select audience whose reactions might prove equally illuminating. Miss Cordelia Fairfax occupied her customary place of honor in the front row. Her evening dress of deep blue silk perfectly appropriate for the occasion, yet somehow suggesting careful preparation rather than mere social compliance. The leather notebook that had commanded so much of her attention throughout the day rested in her lap, though Alain observed that her focus seemed directed more toward the assembled company than toward the stage where the students were making their final preparations. As the opening scenes of Webster's tragedy unfolded, the Gothic setting of the Abbey lent an almost unsettling authenticity to the dark tale of corruption and revenge. The young woman playing the Duchess possessed a natural grace that transcended the limitations of amateur training, while her fellow students channeled their nervous energy into performances that achieved genuine power through sheer intensity of feeling. Director Ashcroft's staging took full advantage of the architectural possibilities offered by arches and shadows, creating tableaux that seemed to emerge from the stones themselves. Yet Alain found his attention drawn as much to the audience as to the performance. Miss Fairfax followed the action with an intensity that seemed almost too focused, her head occasionally turning not toward the stage, but scanning the rows of faculty and patrons behind her. It was a subtle gesture, barely perceptible, yet to Alain's trained observation, it suggested a mind preoccupied with matters beyond the fictional horrors being enacted before her. Mrs. Mortimer, seated beside her with the alert posture of someone whose protective instincts had been heightened by circumstances she could not quite define, occasionally leaned in to whisper a comment, receiving in return polite but somewhat distracted acknowledgement. Dr. Bellwether watched from his position near the rear with the anxious pride of someone whose professional future depended upon the evening's success, while Professor Whitlock's nervous fidgeting had increased to the point where his program rustled with each involuntary movement. Ashcroft himself stood at the side of the hall, his theatrical instincts focused entirely upon the stage, though occasional glances toward Miss Fairfax suggested awareness of concerns beyond artistic achievement. The interval arrived with the customary bustle of amateur theatricals, the audience rising to stretch legs and exchange pleasantries while students adjusted costumes and properties behind improvised curtains. Miss Fairfax rose with characteristic efficiency, leaning toward Mrs. Mortimer with words that carried just far enough to reach Alain's attentive ears. "Rather close in here, Helena. I believe I shall take some air in the cloisters. Please do not trouble yourself to accompany me. I shall not be long." Mrs. Mortimer, though accustomed to her charge's independent spirit, offered a faint frown of concern. "Are you quite certain, Cordelia? The evening air can be rather sharp, and you have seemed rather preoccupied of late." "Quite certain," Miss Fairfax replied, her voice carrying that particular note of gentle finality that discouraged further discussion. "I find I require a moment's solitude to collect my thoughts." Her departure was accomplished with such understated discretion that few beyond Alain and Mrs. Mortimer seemed to notice it. She moved toward one of the side doors that led directly to the cloistered courtyard, pausing only to exchange a brief nod with Dr. Bellwether, who was making his diplomatic rounds among the patrons. The interval passed with the usual polite exchanges over small glasses of sherry and rather dry biscuits. Dr. Bellwether made his customary progress through the gathering, offering pleasantries while his eyes frequently drifted toward the door through which Miss Fairfax had departed. Ashcroft, still flushed with the intensity of the first act, held court near the stage, accepting congratulations with theatrical flourish. The atmosphere remained one of cultivated appreciation, though Alain detected undercurrents of tension that had little to do with dramatic criticism. As the bell chimed to signal the resumption of the performance, the audience began to settle back into their seats with the docility of habit. Alain observed Mrs. Mortimer glance pointedly at the empty chair beside her, a flicker of something beyond mere impatience crossing her composed features. The lights dimmed, a hush fell over the assembly, and the second act began, Webster's tragic narrative resuming its inexorable course toward catastrophe. Miss Fairfax's seat remained conspicuously vacant. A few heads turned, a few curious glances were exchanged, but the social imperative of not disrupting the performance held sway. It was assumed by most that their esteemed patron would return momentarily, perhaps having been delayed by an unexpected encounter in the gardens. Yet as the scenes unfolded, and the fictional Duchess met her grim fate, the empty chair became a silent but increasingly insistent presence. Mrs. Mortimer's initial impatience gave way to a rigid stillness that spoke of growing, carefully controlled alarm. Her attention, previously divided between performance and propriety, became focused entirely upon the entrance through which her employer should have returned. When the final curtain fell to enthusiastic applause, her composure finally began to show signs of strain. "Dr. Bellwether," she said, approaching him with carefully modulated urgency as the audience began to disperse. "Miss Fairfax has not returned. She never misses a conclusion. She considers it a great discourtesy to the performers." A discreet search of the obvious locations yielded nothing more substantial than growing concern. The ladies' retiring room, the main entrance, even the director's office revealed no trace of the missing patron. Dr. Bellwether, his scholarly composure beginning to crack, turned to Alien with the careful manner of someone requesting assistance while hoping to avoid scandal. "Roderick, I find myself in the rather awkward position of requesting your professional expertise. Purely as a precaution, you understand. Miss Fairfax is not given to unexplained absences, and given the rather delicate nature of certain discussions that have been taking place." As the evening's celebration gradually dissolved into worried consultation, Alan reflected upon the theatrical irony of the situation. The Duchess of Malfi had met her fate through the machinations of those she trusted, while here at Ravenshollow Abbey, their own patron had simply vanished into the Gothic shadows. The candles continued to flicker in their iron sconces, casting dancing patterns that seemed to mock the assembled company's growing unease with the patient indifference of stones that had witnessed many human dramas, both staged and terrifyingly real. It was then, as Alain made his way toward the side door to begin a methodical search of the cloisters, that he noticed something that gave him pause. On the flagstone threshold, barely visible in the uncertain light, lay a small object that gleamed dully against the ancient stone. Bending to examine it more closely, he found a pearl, a single, perfectly matched pearl that might have come from any lady's necklace, yet somehow seemed to carry with it the weight of significance far beyond its modest beauty. Dawn approached Ravenshollow Abbey with the diffident quality of autumn light that seems to apologize for disturbing the shadows of night. The ancient stones, darkened by centuries of weather and worn smooth by countless seasons, received the pale illumination with the patient dignity of structures that have witnessed the rise and fall of human ambitions. In the crypt beneath the south transept, where medieval abbots lay in their stone repose, the air held a chill that penetrated beyond mere temperature, carrying with it the weight of centuries and the particular stillness that belongs to places set apart from the world of the living. Brother Thomas, whose care of the abbey's physical needs had become a devotion transcending mere employment, descended the worn stone steps with his customary measured pace. His key ring, heavy with the responsibility of maintaining an institution where past and present coexisted in delicate balance, jingled softly in the morning quiet. The elderly caretaker moved with the patient economy of the long-employed, his footsteps absorbed by the thick dust of time that seemed to settle perpetually in this forgotten corner of the abbey. What he discovered there among the stone effigies transformed the sacred space into something altogether more sinister. Miss Cordelia Fairfax lay upon the flagstones near the lowest step, her evening dress of blue silk creating a startling contrast against the gray antiquity that surrounded her. The peaceful expression on her face suggested sleep rather than death, yet the unnatural stillness of her form and the subtle wrongness of her position among the medieval tombs spoke eloquently of violence concealed beneath apparent tranquility. Brother Thomas stood for a moment in the doorway, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he crossed himself with the automatic gesture of someone whose faith had been tested, but not broken by the intrusion of evil, into sacred ground. "Dear Lord, preserve us," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the stone-walled silence, before turning to seek Dr. Bellwether with the urgent haste of someone bearing news too terrible for delay. Dr. Bellwether's arrival, his academic composure struggling against the reality of violent death, brought with it Inspector Allen, whose light sleep had been disturbed by the commotion above. The detective descended to the crypt with the calm professionalism of someone whose experience had taught him that human nature was capable of horrors that transcended social boundaries. "I have touched nothing," Brother Thomas said, his voice carrying the particular steadiness of someone who had found strength in routine observance. "I came down, as I always do, to check that all was secure, and found her as you see her now." Alain's initial examination revealed details that spoke of careful planning rather than impulsive violence. Miss Cordelia Fairfax had been dead for several hours, the coolness of the crypt having preserved her body in a state that made precise timing difficult without professional assistance. Her evening dress, though somewhat disarranged, showed no signs of struggle, while her hands, folded with apparent care, suggested that her killer had possessed either genuine reverence for the dead or a theatrical sense of appropriate staging. The crypt itself told a more complex story to Alain's trained observation. One of the stone slabs covering the medieval tombs had been slightly displaced, its heavy mass shifted just enough to create a narrow gap that spoke of recent disturbance. Scuff marks on the ancient floor, barely visible in the uncertain light, suggested purposeful movement through the space. Most intriguingly, the air carried a faint scent that seemed alien to the musty atmosphere of centuries-old stone, something elusive and faintly sweet, like the shadow of a spilled draught. As word of the tragedy spread through the abbey, Alain observed the various reactions with the particular attention of someone whose profession had taught him that grief and shock could reveal as much about the living as about the dead. Mrs. Mortimer's controlled hysteria spoke of decades of protective devotion, while Professor Whitlock's nervous energy transformed into something approaching paralysis. Director Ashcroft's theatrical instincts seemed both heightened and constrained by genuine drama that no amount of training could have prepared him to face. The local constabulary, recognizing the gravity of the situation, deferred to Allen's expertise with visible relief. As Inspector Fox arrived with his small contingent, Alain reflected upon the scene with the melancholy understanding that violent death, however carefully staged, always carried with it a quality of waste that transcended mere criminality. The morning light, growing stronger with each passing moment, illuminated details that dawn's uncertainty had left in shadow. Yet even as the physical evidence became clearer, the human motivations that had led to this violation of sanctuary remained as mysterious as the stone faces of the medieval effigies who had become unwilling witnesses to a crime that challenged every principle of civilized behavior. Miss Cordelia Fairfax, who had devoted her life to the support of artistic endeavor, had found her final role in a drama far more terrible than any that had ever graced the Abbey's makeshift stage. The Abbey's old library retained the hushed reverence of centuries devoted to learning, its oak-paneled walls darkened by time and contemplation into the rich patina of scholarly devotion. Morning light filtered through diamond-paned windows in geometric patterns that seemed to dance across leather-bound volumes, arranged with monastic precision along towering shelves. The great table that dominated the center of the room bore the polish of countless scholarly elbows, its surface now serving the more immediate purpose of displaying the personal effects that would illuminate the final days of Miss Cordelia Fairfax. The air carried the mingled scents of old paper, beeswax, and that particular mustiness that speaks of knowledge accumulated and preserved through the patient passage of years. Inspector Alain approached the table with his characteristic methodical precision, his movements as quiet and considered as the turning of an ancient manuscript. The leather notebook that had commanded so much of Miss Fairfax's attention lay open before him, its pages revealing a story far more complex than mere philanthropic interest. Professor Whitlock entered with the particular hesitation of someone whose professional competence was about to undergo scrutiny that transcended academic evaluation, His nervous energy transformed into something approaching paralysis as he recognized documents he had hoped would remain buried beneath layers of administrative discretion. These are rather more detailed than one might expect from even the most conscientious patron, Alain observed, his voice carrying the particular neutrality that made statement more effective than accusation. Miss Fairfax appears to have been conducting what one might term a comprehensive audit of the Academy's financial arrangements. The notebook revealed a systematic investigation that spoke of intelligence applied with ruthless thoroughness. Miss Fairfax had cross-referenced official reports with bank statements, traced payments through multiple accounts, and documented discrepancies with the precision of someone whose business acumen had been sharpened by years of managing substantial wealth. Her notes, written in a clear, decisive hand, painted a picture of financial manipulation that was sophisticated in its conception and devastating in its implications. There were no signs of crude embezzlement, but rather a complex pattern of creative bookkeeping that had been masking the true extent of the Academy's financial crisis for what appeared to be several years. The irregularities, Whitlock began, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone forced to acknowledge truths that professional pride had long concealed, were never intended as permanent solutions. The Academy's funding has always been somewhat unpredictable, dependent as we are upon the goodwill of patrons whose own circumstances may change without notice. One must borrow from the future with the intention of restoring when circumstances permit. Alain turned to a page marked with particular emphasis, where Miss Fairfax had documented transfers that suggested financial creativity elevated to the level of artistic endeavor. Yet these arrangements appear to have persisted for some considerable time. 3 years, according to these calculations, during which funds designated for specific purposes have been redirected to cover operational expenses. Dr. Bellwether's arrival interrupted the increasingly uncomfortable examination, his scholarly composure intact, but his eyes betraying the strain of someone whose life's work had become entangled with circumstances beyond comfortable control. His greeting carried the particular warmth reserved for old friends whose professional expertise had become suddenly essential, though Allen noted the careful way his friend avoided direct examination of the documents spread across the ancient table. "I trust Professor Whitlock has been able to clarify any questions about our administrative procedures," Bellwether said, his voice carrying the diplomatic tone of someone accustomed to navigating between competing interests. Miss Fairfax was always remarkably thorough in her inquiries, though I confess I was not entirely aware of the extent of her recent investigations. Whitlock's interview revealed a man caught between loyalty to the institution he had served for decades and growing awareness that his trust had been systematically tested by circumstances that demanded compromise with principles he had once considered absolute. His admission that Miss Fairfax had been pressing for detailed explanations of the Academy's financial arrangements carried the weight of someone who had hoped such scrutiny might be avoided through diplomatic deflection. "She had scheduled a meeting for this morning," Whitlock said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She wished to discuss what she termed necessary adjustments to our financial arrangements. I had the impression she was preparing to take decisive action regarding her discoveries." The leather notebook contained correspondence that revealed the true scope of Miss Fairfax's investigation. Letters to auditors, inquiries to banks, and careful documentation of conversations suggested a woman who had discovered something that troubled her sufficiently to risk the social awkwardness of questioning those she had previously trusted without reservation. Her final entries carried the particular urgency of someone approaching conclusions that would require immediate remedy. As Alain examined the documents more closely, he noticed something that gave him pause. The elderly blotter on the table, with its succession of used sheets, had preserved the mirror image of recent correspondence. Lifting the top leaf carefully, he could discern the faint, reversed impression of words. Board of Trustees, and below it, what appeared to be morning meeting. He looked questioningly at Whitlock, whose face had grown notably pale. Miss Fairfax completed a formal letter yesterday evening, Whitlock admitted with the reluctance of someone confessing a professional failing. A draft communication to the Academy's Board of Trustees that would have exposed the full extent of our financial arrangements. She sealed it with her own wax, intending to present it this morning rather than trust such sensitive matters to the post. Alain's attention was drawn to a thin curl of red sealing wax caught in the notebook's binding, its bright color a sharp contrast against the aged leather. The fragment matched perfectly with the piece he had observed by the scriptorium door, suggesting a connection between Miss Fairfax's investigation and her final evening that extended beyond mere coincidence. "This letter," Alain said carefully. "Where is it now?" The silence that followed carried implications that extended far beyond mere financial irregularity. Whitlock's hands trembled as he adjusted his spectacles, while Bellwether's scholarly composure showed signs of strain that spoke of pressures that had nothing to do with academic administration. "She had it with her when she left for the performance," Whitlock finally managed. "Said she would keep it secure until our morning meeting. I assumed it remained in her possession." As Alain continued his methodical examination of the papers, his fingers discovered something that had been overlooked in the initial survey. Tucked beneath a sheaf of financial statements lay a small brass key attached to a length of faded ribbon, its surface green with age and its purpose identified by a paper label so worn that only the letters K.T. remained legible. The key's discovery brought a sharp intake of breath from Professor Whitlock, whose recognition of the object was immediate and unmistakable. The morning light continued to cast its geometric patterns across the ancient table, but the shadows seemed to have grown longer, reaching towards secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. In the quiet of the library, surrounded by volumes that celebrated human learning and achievement, the three men contemplated the possibility that education and murder had become entangled in ways that challenged every assumption about civilized behavior. The ledger's tale was one of trust violated and principles compromised, yet the human story behind the figures remained as elusive as the morning mist that still clung to the abbey's ancient stones, while the small brass key lay silent on the oak table like a question that demanded an answer from the depths of the earth itself. The old chapter house retained the austere dignity of its monastic origins, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to absorb both sound and confession with the patient discretion of stones that had witnessed centuries of human frailty. The circular chamber, where medieval abbots had once deliberated matters of spiritual governance, now served as Inspector Allen's temporary interview room, its Gothic windows casting geometric patterns of light across the ancient oak table that dominated the space. The morning air carried the lingering scent of centuries-old incense, mingled now with the more immediate presence of grease paint and that particular mustiness that accompanies theatrical properties stored in sacred spaces, transformed to secular purpose. Vivian Ashcroft entered with the controlled grace of someone whose every gesture had been refined through years of stage training. Yet Allen observed that beneath the theatrical poise lay something approaching genuine distress. The director's customary flamboyance seemed muted by circumstances that no amount of dramatic experience could have prepared him to face, his movements carrying the particular restraint of someone who had discovered that real tragedy possessed a weight that transcended artistic interpretation. "Inspector Allen," Ashcroft said, his voice carrying the modulated tones of professional training while betraying an underlying tension that spoke of sleepless hours and uncomfortable reflections. "I confess myself quite unprepared for such a catastrophe within these walls. Miss Fairfax was the very essence of refined patronage, her support both generous and, I had believed, unquestioning." Alain settled himself in one of the high-backed chairs, his manner suggesting polite interest rather than official interrogation. "Yet I understand that Miss Fairfax had become rather more inquisitive than usual regarding the Academy's financial arrangements. Dr. Bellwether mentioned that her questions had grown increasingly detailed." The director's theatrical instincts seemed to war with the necessity for candor, his hands moving in unconscious gestures that betrayed someone accustomed to using physical expression to supplement verbal communication. Miss Fairfax was always thorough in her inquiries, naturally. However, I must admit that her recent interest had become rather more intensive than one might consider strictly necessary for even the most conscientious benefactor. Alain noted the careful phrasing that suggested diplomatic training rather than genuine transparency. "I believe you had occasion to speak with her privately yesterday morning. In the scriptorium, was it not?" The question produced a momentary stillness that spoke of memories the director would have preferred to leave unexamined. Ashcroft moved to one of the Gothic windows, his silhouette against the morning light creating the sort of dramatic tableau that seemed second nature to someone whose profession demanded constant awareness of visual effect. "Miss Fairfax had expressed certain concerns about our proposed expansion," he said, his voice carrying the particular care of someone choosing words with theatrical precision. "She had been pressing me about the financial projections, particularly regarding costings that Dr. Bellwether had presented to the board. She seemed to possess rather detailed knowledge of our internal arrangements, knowledge that one would not normally share with even the most generous patron." The admission carried implications that extended beyond mere administrative discussion, and Alain observed the subtle tension that accompanied the director's careful revelations. "These concerns were specific in nature?" Ashcroft turned from the window with a movement that seemed choreographed, yet betrayed genuine discomfort. She had somehow obtained copies of our financial statements for the past several years. Her questions carried the particular precision of someone who had conducted independent research rather than relying upon official explanations. It felt less like a discussion of patronage and more like an examination of my knowledge regarding matters I had been assured were not my concern. The revelation painted a picture of Miss Fairfax as an active investigator whose quiet determination had threatened to unravel carefully constructed facades. Alan's subsequent interview with Mrs. Helena Mortimer, conducted in the modest guest sitting room, provided crucial context to the director's carefully evasive account. Mrs. Mortimer sat with the rigid composure of someone whose professional dignity had been maintained through sheer force of will, her hands folded in her lap, betraying only the slightest tremor. "Miss Fairfax had become quite preoccupied with the Academy's affairs these past weeks, Inspector," she said, her voice steady despite evident strain. "More than usual, even for her. I often tried to dissuade her, telling her it was not her place to delve so deeply into matters that were, after all, the responsibility of the administration." "You considered it meddling, Mrs. Mortimer?" Alain inquired with careful neutrality. She considered it her duty to ensure her investments were properly placed. But it became more than that. She spoke of irregularities that required correction, of obligations that had been neglected. I warned her that such endeavors could prove unpleasant, even dangerous. There are always those who resent scrutiny, particularly when it touches upon their professional competence. Mrs. Mortimer's account confirmed that Miss Fairfax had prepared formal documentation of her discoveries. She sealed a letter yesterday evening before the performance, a packet addressed to the trustee's secretary. I saw her apply the wax with particular care. She carried it in her reticule, intending to present it this morning along with her other findings. The revelation of the missing letter added urgency to Alain's investigation. As he prepared to conclude the interviews, his attention was drawn to a faint, elusive scent that seemed to drift from the direction of the old property's room. Following the subtle trail, he discovered a small chamber where theatrical supplies were stored among the detritus of past productions. On a shallow shelf, among an assortment of stage daggers and corked phials labeled in neat theatrical script, Laudanum, Opium, Aquatophana, a rectangular patch of dust marked the absence of a small bottle. A penciled inventory hung from a string, and beside the word "files" was a figure that had been crossed out and adjusted downward by one in a different hand. The room was very quiet, yet somewhere a floorboard creaked with the habitual complaint of old wood. The sweet scent that had drawn him there seemed to withdraw into the stone itself, leaving the corridor colder than before. As Alan stood in the doorway of the properties room, contemplating the significance of the missing theatrical poison, he reflected upon the complex web of dependencies that had bound the Academy's survival to Cordelia Fairfax's continued support and discretion. Her death represented not merely the loss of a benefactor, but the abrupt cessation of an investigation that someone had found sufficiently threatening to warrant the ultimate silencing. The morning light continued to cast its patterns through the Gothic windows, but the shadows seemed to have grown longer, reaching towards secrets that had been protected through the most final of performances, while the ancient stones maintained their patient silence, having witnessed confessions far more terrible than any that had ever graced the Academy's makeshift stage. The afternoon light, filtered through the narrow windows of the Abbey's crypt, cast geometric patterns across flagstones that had absorbed centuries of whispered confessions and solemn prayers. The air carried that particular chill which belongs not merely to underground spaces, but to places where human secrets have been buried beneath layers of sanctified stone. Inspector Allen descended the worn steps with Brother Thomas and Inspector Fox, their footsteps echoing softly in the vaulted chamber where medieval abbots lay in their eternal repose. The morning's discovery had transformed this sacred space into something altogether more sinister, yet the stone effigies maintained their patient vigil with the indifference of those who had witnessed many human dramas unfold in the shadows of eternity. Brother Thomas moved with the careful reverence of someone whose life had been devoted to the meticulous care of sacred spaces, his keys jingling softly as he approached the displaced stone slab that had caught Alan's attention during the initial examination. "The stone has been moved recently, Inspector," he observed, his weathered hands tracing the faint scratches on the surrounding flagstones. These marks suggest it was dragged rather than merely shifted by settling. It would require considerable effort and knowledge of what lay beneath. With the assistance of Inspector Fox, the heavy slab was carefully moved aside to reveal not merely an empty cavity, but a sophisticated hiding place that spoke of long use and intimate familiarity with the Abbey's architectural secrets. The space behind the nearest effigy had been hollowed out with medieval precision, creating a repository that could conceal documents while protecting them from the dampness that plagued less carefully chosen locations. Alain's torch beam revealed a leather-wrapped packet, its surface bearing the unmistakable seal of red wax that had become so significant to his investigation. The documents within painted a picture of systematic deception that was both more sophisticated and more damaging than Alain had initially suspected. Miss Fairfax's meticulous investigation had uncovered a pattern of creative accounting that spanned several years, transforming the Academy's precarious financial position into an elaborate fiction maintained through careful manipulation of records and strategic redirection of funds. Her notes, written in the clear, decisive hand he had come to recognize, documented not crude embezzlement, but a complex shell game designed to mask the institution's true condition while maintaining the appearance of fiscal responsibility to patrons and trustees alike. Most significantly, the cache contained a draft letter addressed to the Academy's Board of Trustees that would have exposed the full extent of the financial irregularities. The document, written with the precision of someone accustomed to business correspondence, outlined specific discrepancies and demanded immediate investigation. Its existence explained the urgency that had marked Miss Fairfax's recent behavior and provided a compelling motive for someone whose professional reputation depended upon maintaining the carefully constructed facade. "She arranged to meet someone here during the performance," Alain said, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of theoretical reconstruction finding physical confirmation. The crypt provided both privacy and psychological pressure. Few people could maintain comfortable deception surrounded by stone witnesses to centuries of human judgment. As Aline continued his methodical examination, additional evidence emerged that connected the crime directly to the Academy's theatrical activities. Behind another effigy, where shadows gathered most thickly, he discovered traces of stage paint, the particular shade of green favored by modern lighting theories, smeared faintly on the ancient stone. A broken clasp, torn from blue silk and bearing threads that matched Miss Fairfax's evening dress, lay concealed beneath centuries of accumulated dust. Most tellingly, a fragment of black stage tape, used to mark positions and secure cables in theatrical productions, clung to the base of a medieval column where it would have been invisible in the uncertain light. The killer possessed intimate knowledge of both the Academy's finances and its theatrical operations, Aline observed, collecting the evidence with careful precision. They knew about Miss Fairfax's investigation, understood the significance of these hidden documents, and came prepared not merely for discussion, but for permanent resolution. The reconstruction of events became increasingly clear as the physical evidence accumulated. Miss Fairfax had left the performance during the interval, using her announced walk in the cloisters as cover for a clandestine meeting in the crypt. She had brought her damning evidence, perhaps intending to offer one final opportunity for explanation or reform. The killer had arrived with theatrical poison, a small phial from the Academy's properties collection, and the knowledge that exposure would mean professional and personal ruin. The murder itself had been accomplished with theatrical precision, the poison swift enough to prevent any cry for help, yet subtle enough to leave minimal physical evidence. The killer's familiarity with dramatic properties had provided both means and method, while their intimate knowledge of the Abbey's layout had ensured privacy for the fatal encounter. The careful positioning of the body suggested either genuine remorse or a theatrical sense of appropriate staging that spoke of someone whose entire life had been devoted to the creation of convincing illusions. Yet even as the physical evidence revealed the mechanics of the crime, the human motivations remained as complex as the financial web that had precipitated the tragedy. Someone had loved the Academy enough to kill for it, yet their desperate act had ensured the very destruction they had sought to prevent. The institution's survival had depended upon Miss Fairfax's continued support and discretion, both of which had been sacrificed to protect secrets that would now inevitably be exposed through the investigation of her murder. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting longer shadows across the ancient stones, Aline reflected upon the tragic irony that had transformed sanctuary into the scene of calculated murder. The crypt, with its patient stone witnesses and hidden cavities, seemed to exhale the weight of centuries as he contemplated a crime that had violated every principle of civilized behavior, while attempting to preserve an institution devoted to the highest expressions of human culture. In the growing darkness, the medieval effigies maintained their eternal vigil, their carved features bearing witness to the truth that some secrets, once disturbed from their hiding places in ancient stone, could never again find rest in the shadows of sanctified ground. The killer's desperate gamble had failed, leaving behind evidence that would prove more damaging than any investigation Miss Fairfax might have conducted, while the Abbey itself seemed to settle more deeply into its foundations, as if acknowledging that it had become the repository for secrets far more terrible than any its original builders had ever imagined. The sweet scent that had first drawn Aline's attention lingered in the cold air like an accusation, while somewhere in the darkness above, the living continued their careful performances, unaware that the final act of their particular tragedy was already being written in the patient stones beneath their feet. The great hall of Ravenshollow Abbey had been restored to its customary dignity, though traces of the previous evening's theatrical transformation lingered like echoes of a performance that would never be repeated. The velvet hangings, drawn back to admit the pale afternoon light, cast long shadows across Persian carpets that seemed to absorb both sound and sorrow with equal discretion. Chairs had been arranged in a careful semicircle before the great fireplace, where the remains of a modest fire settled into grey ash with the quiet finality of conclusions reached. The wrought iron sconces, unlit in the daylight, maintained their silent vigil against stone walls that had witnessed centuries of human drama, though none quite so tragic as the revelation that was about to unfold. Inspector Allen stood near the Gothic windows, his silhouette against the afternoon light creating the sort of dramatic tableau that would have pleased any theatrical director, yet his manner carried none of the artificial tension of staged revelation. Instead, he possessed the quiet authority of someone whose professional experience had taught him that truth, however carefully concealed, possessed a weight that transcended any dramatic artifice. Dr. Marcus Bellwether occupied the chair nearest to the fire, his scholarly composure intact, but his eyes betraying the particular strain of someone whose life's work had become entangled with circumstances beyond comfortable control. Professor Whitlock sat with his customary nervous energy transformed into an unnatural stillness, while Director Ashcroft maintained his theatrical bearing, though stripped of much of his usual flamboyance. Mrs. Helena Mortimer chose a position slightly apart, her rigid posture speaking of grief tempered by decades of practical devotion and the fierce loyalty of someone determined to see justice done for her lost charge. "We have gathered," Alain began, his voice carrying the particular clarity that commanded attention without demanding it, "to bring resolution to the tragic events that have transformed this sanctuary of learning into the scene of calculated murder. Miss Cordelia Fairfax died not through mischance or sudden illness, but as the direct result of deliberate action taken by someone who possessed intimate knowledge of both her investigation and the Academy's most carefully guarded secrets. The silence that followed carried implications that extended far beyond mere academic scandal, and Alain's methodical reconstruction began to reveal a crime born not of greed, but of desperate institutional loyalty. The financial irregularities that Miss Fairfax discovered through her meticulous investigation were not the crude embezzlement they might initially appear to be. They represented instead a complex series of well-intentioned but unauthorized expenditures, designed to keep the Academy functioning during periods when legitimate funding proved insufficient. What began as temporary borrowing to bridge funding gaps evolved into a sophisticated system of creative accounting that required Miss Fairfax's continued ignorance to maintain. Alain moved to the evidence arranged upon the oak table, the theatrical poison phial with its faded label, the fragments of correspondence, the brass key that had unlocked secrets hidden in ancient stone. Each piece told part of a story that revealed how institutional devotion could be corrupted into something far more dangerous than mere financial impropriety. The killer possessed not only administrative access to the Academy's financial records, but also intimate knowledge of its physical layout and theatrical resources. They understood that Miss Fairfax's moral inflexibility would not permit the sort of gradual reform that might have preserved both the institution and its reputation. Her investigation had reached the point where exposure was inevitable, and with it, the complete collapse of everything they had devoted their life to building and preserving. Professor Whitlock's hands trembled as he removed his spectacles, the gesture betraying nervous energy that had been building throughout the day. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the particular strain of someone whose professional competence had been systematically compromised by circumstances beyond his control. The irregularities were never intended as permanent solutions. One had to choose between allowing the institution to collapse or finding creative ways to bridge temporary gaps in funding. Alain's attention turned to Dr. Bellwether, whose scholarly composure had begun to show signs of strain that spoke of pressures extending far beyond academic administration. "Dr. Bellwether, you have served this institution with distinction for many years. Your devotion to its educational mission has been absolute. Your commitment to its students unwavering. Yet that very devotion, when combined with the desperate circumstances that threatened the Academy's survival, led you to make choices that compromised not only your professional integrity, but ultimately your moral foundation." The revelation that followed carried the particular shock of truth that had been carefully concealed beneath layers of academic respectability and professional courtesy. Elaine's voice remained steady as he outlined how Dr. Bellwether had systematically redirected funds, altered reports, and maintained the elaborate fiction of fiscal stability that had kept the Academy functioning while its true financial condition deteriorated beyond hope of conventional recovery. Miss Fairfax's investigation threatened to expose not merely financial irregularities, but the complete collapse of the careful structure you had built to preserve this institution. Her letter to the Board of Trustees, sealed with her own wax and intended for presentation this morning, would have destroyed not only your professional reputation, but the Academy itself. In the crypt during that fatal meeting, you hoped for one final negotiation, perhaps believing that her attachment to the institution might overcome her moral principles. But Miss Fairfax's integrity was absolute. She would not countenance deception, regardless of the consequences. Dr. Bellwether's scholarly mask began to crack as the full implications of Elaine's reconstruction became clear. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of institutional mortality and personal defeat. The Academy represented everything I believed education could achieve. Its students, its mission, its contribution to human culture, all of it would have been lost. Miss Fairfax could not see beyond the immediate scandal to the greater good that might have been preserved. Elaine's expression carried a touch of melancholy as he continued his explanation. You brought the theatrical poison from the Academy's own collection, perhaps not with premeditated intent to murder, but as a desperate final option. The file, labeled in the neat script of your properties inventory, provided both means and a certain grim appropriateness, an institution devoted to dramatic art providing the instrument of its patron's destruction. In that ancient crypt, surrounded by stone witnesses to centuries of human judgment, you administered the fatal draft and removed the sealed letter that would have exposed your years of financial manipulation. The tragic irony of the situation settled upon the assembled company with the cold weight of ancient stone. Mrs. Mortimer's controlled grief spoke of decades of protective devotion, while Professor Whitlock's nervous energy had transformed into something approaching paralysis as he contemplated the complete collapse of everything he had worked to support. The most profound tragedy, Dr. Bellwether, Elaine concluded, his voice softened by genuine regret, is that your crime has ensured the very destruction you fought so desperately to prevent. Miss Fairfax's murder has guaranteed that the Academy cannot survive, for no institution built upon noble ideals can long endure the stain of violence committed in its name. You believed you were preserving something greater than individual life. Yet in doing so, you have destroyed both the woman who supported your work and the institution she died to reform. Dr. Bellwether remained motionless for a long moment, his head bowed in acknowledgement of truths that could no longer be denied or deflected. When he finally looked up, his scholarly composure had been replaced by something approaching peace, the terrible relief of someone whose long-carried burden had finally been set down. I regret only, he said quietly, that Miss Fairfax could not understand the greater good that might have been achieved. The Academy was more than mere financial arrangements. It was a living testament to human artistic achievement. Yet I see now that some prices are too high to pay, even for the most noble purposes. As the afternoon light continued to fade, casting longer shadows across the ancient stones, the great hall settled into a deeper silence that spoke of conclusions reached and performances concluded. The abbey, with its Gothic arches and centuries of accumulated dignity, seemed to exhale the weight of human ambition and failure, while the assembled company contemplated the ruins of their carefully constructed world. In the growing darkness, Inspector Allen reflected upon the tragic irony that had transformed an institution devoted to the highest expressions of human culture into the scene of calculated murder. where love of art had been corrupted into something that violated every principle it claimed to serve. The final curtain had fallen on a performance that no amount of theatrical training could have prepared them to witness, leaving behind only the echo of applause that would never again sound within these walls, and the knowledge that some secrets, once exposed to the harsh light of investigation, could never again find sanctuary in the shadows of sanctified ground. The November morning that settled over Raven's Hollow Abbey carried with it the particular melancholy that accompanies the end of cherished illusions. A fine rain traced dark lines along the ancient stonework, gathering in quiet pools upon the flagstones where medieval monks had once walked in contemplation. The cloisters, which had briefly echoed with the voices of students pursuing dramatic excellence, now absorbed the sound of footsteps with the patient discretion of spaces returning to their original sacred purpose. The air held that distinctive chill which speaks not merely of approaching winter, but of institutions whose time has passed, leaving behind only the echo of ambitions that had flourished briefly before being sacrificed to the desperate mathematics of survival. Inspector Allen stood in the old library, where morning light filtered through diamond-paned windows to illuminate documents that would never again serve their intended purpose. The leather-bound volumes seemed to regard the scattered papers with the patient indifference of knowledge that transcends human ambition, while the great oak table bore witness to the accumulated evidence that had transformed academic sanctuary into the scene of calculated murder. His reflection upon the case carried the particular satisfaction of justice served, tempered by genuine regret for the human cost of institutional loyalty, corrupted into something far more dangerous than mere financial impropriety. Mrs. Helena Mortimer entered with the measured composure of someone whose grief had been tempered by decades of practical devotion and the fierce determination to see her charge's final wishes honored despite tragic circumstances. Her black mourning dress, perfectly appropriate yet somehow suggesting personal loss rather than mere social observance, lent her an authority that transcended her position as companion and secretary. The small jewel case she carried seemed to possess the weight of a reliquary, its contents representing the careful restoration of order to chaos. "Inspector," she said, her voice steady despite evident strain, "I believe this belongs to the investigation's final accounting." She opened the case to reveal Miss Fairfax's pearl necklace, now complete with the single sphere that Alain had discovered on the threshold of the cloister door. Cordelia would have minded its loss. She took comfort in small symmetries, even in the midst of larger disruptions. Professor Whitlock appeared in the doorway with the hesitant gait of someone whose professional world had collapsed overnight, his nervous energy transformed into the hollow exhaustion of institutional mortality. His interview with a board of trustees had revealed the full extent of the financial deception that Dr. Bellwether's sophisticated manipulation had concealed, while the Academy's association with murder had made continued operation impossible despite any potential resolution of fiscal irregularities. "The remaining patrons have withdrawn their support," Whitlock said, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone acknowledging professional failure. "Even those who might have overlooked financial irregularities cannot countenance association with violent crime. The students' families are making arrangements for transfers to institutions whose reputations remain unmarked by scandal." The implications extended far beyond mere administrative dissolution. Miss Fairfax's will, Mrs. Mortimer explained, had contained provisions that revealed a woman whose business acumen had been matched by prophetic understanding of human nature. Her designation of funds for educational purposes included specific instructions for their transfer to institutions whose integrity remained unquestioned, while the Abbey itself would revert to church authorities who had maintained nominal ownership throughout its secular transformation. Director Ashcroft's arrival interrupted their melancholy deliberations, his theatrical bearing somewhat diminished by circumstances that no amount of dramatic training could have prepared him to face. His announcement that the remaining students wished to present a final performance carried the particular poignancy of artistic endeavor persisting despite institutional collapse, though the gesture seemed more elegiac than celebratory. "Webster's tragedy has acquired rather more authenticity than any of us intended," Ashcroft observed, his voice carrying the irony of someone whose professional life had been devoted to creating convincing illusions. "The students wish to complete their artistic obligations, though I suspect the performance will serve more as memorial than entertainment." Brother Thomas, whose care of the Abbey's physical needs had transcended mere employment to become genuine devotion, moved through the buildings with methodical precision, ensuring that the transition from secular to sacred purpose would be accomplished with appropriate dignity. His keys, heavy with the responsibility of maintaining spaces where human ambition had been tested and found wanting, jingled softly as he secured rooms that would soon return to contemplative silence. As afternoon approached, visitors from the diocesan authorities conducted their inspection with the particular thoroughness of those who must restore sanctity to spaces contaminated by violence. Their quiet consultation with Brother Thomas suggested that the Abbey's return to purely religious purposes would require both physical renovation and spiritual purification, though the ancient stones seemed to regard such human concerns with the patient indifference of structures that had witnessed many transformations throughout their long existence. The final interviews carried the weight of conclusions reached and performances concluded. Mrs. Mortimer's arrangements for the disposition of Miss Fairfax's personal effects revealed loyalty that had transcended mere employment to become genuine affection, though her own future remained as uncertain as the institution her charge had died trying to reform. Professor Whitlock's careful documentation of the Academy's final accounts spoke of professional duty maintained despite personal devastation, while Ashcroft's plans for preserving theatrical properties suggested hope that artistic dreams might survive institutional collapse. As evening approached, Alain prepared for his departure with the melancholy understanding that some crimes, while solved, could never truly be resolved in their human dimensions. The case had revealed how institutional devotion, when tested by desperate circumstances, could be corrupted into something that violated every principle it claimed to serve. Dr. Bellwether's love for the Academy had been genuine, yet his desperate attempt to preserve it had ensured its destruction while taking the life of the woman whose support had made its existence possible. The November twilight that settled over Ravenshollow Abbey carried with it the weight of human tragedy transformed into something approaching peace. The Gothic arches and vaulted chambers, which had briefly housed the dreams of students pursuing artistic excellence, would soon return to the contemplative silence of monastic routine. The cloisters would once again provide sanctuary for those seeking spiritual rather than dramatic illumination, while the ancient stones would resume their patient witness to the eternal cycle of human ambition and failure. As Alan's motor car disappeared into the gathering dusk, he reflected upon the tragic irony that had transformed an institution devoted to the highest expressions of human culture into the scene of calculated murder. Miss Cordelia Fairfax, in death as in life, had ensured that justice would prevail even when mercy had failed, though the cost had been the destruction of everything she had sought to preserve. The final curtain had fallen on a performance that no amount of theatrical training could have prepared them to witness, leaving behind only the knowledge that some prices are too high to pay, even for the most noble purposes. In the growing darkness, the medieval effigies maintained their eternal vigil, having added one more chapter to the long history of human folly and redemption that had unfolded within the sanctuary of ancient stone. The abbey settled into deeper quiet, its transformations complete, while the November wind whispered through empty corridors where dreams had once flourished before being sacrificed to the inexorable demands of truth and the terrible arithmetic of institutional survival. Institutional survival. Institutional survival, institutional survival, institutional survival, institutional survival, institutional survival, institutional survival.